evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to our AIIA Victoria event tonight. My name is Patricia Salas, and I'm General Manager of Operations. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever we might be, in Dyson House or online. We're here today to launch the book How Wars End, co-edited by Professor Damien Kingsbury and Richard Iron. Back in 2021, we had planned an academic conference on how wars end. However, COVID intervened, so the conference was held virtually. But this book is the outcome. It has been an interesting dynamic for our speakers today. We have two subject matter experts, Richard coming from a career fighting wars and Damien from a career negotiating peace. We will take questions at the end of the discussion, and books are available for sale and for signing for those of you who are here at Dyson House today. Now I hand over to Richard and Damien.
20 of the world's foremost experts contributed to our conference and the book on how wars end. 100 hours of recorded testimony, 100,000 words written. Multiple case studies, deep theory, a much greater understanding of what causes wars, what sustains them, and what ends them. But at the end of it all, it took a young man, an intern, who's actually sitting at the back there, working with us to say, so exactly how do wars end? And to make us realize that we really ought to attempt to answer the exam question we'd set ourselves. And to answer it in a way that'll help those in the future, like Damien and me in the past, present in your case, help those faced with trying to bring wars to an end. So what we've done in the conclusion of how wars end theory and practice is develop what we call an approximate theory. And although there are as many ways to end a war as there are wars, there are some constants. And those who've listened to me speak recently on the Ukraine war will have heard some of them. Wars end with combatants exerting some level of coercion on each other and making some kind of compromise. Coercion, compromise. The higher the level of coercion, the more the other side has to compromise. Until you reach a situation where coercion is massive, compromise total, like World War II, unconditional surrender. Wars do sometimes end this way. Someone wins, someone loses. But often wars don't reach this point. Outcomes more balanced, described as a mutually hurting stalemate, where the level of coercion each side can exert on the other is broadly equal, and where the compromises need to end a war are also broadly equal. So what factors influence this coercion compromise equation? We think there are three. First, the balance of military advantage. Battlefield victory and defeat, if you like, obviously. Not just today, but also tomorrow. If you think more military victories are just around the corner, then you're less likely to negotiate today. Wait until tomorrow, and then you'll be in a stronger position. The second factor influencing coercion and compromise is international pressure. Hugely important. Other nations, international organizations as well, can apply pressure or inducements to one or both sides to end conflict, or, as in Ukraine, to support one side and pressurize the other to achieve what many in the international community, including Australia, views as a more equitable peace rather than peace at any price. The third factor influencing coercion and compromise is internal or domestic political pressures. The mood of the population, political divisions in government, changes of government, think of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And today, just compare the strong will of the Ukrainian people against probably the indifference of many ordinary Russians. And autocrat Putin is probably more worried about his own position than democratically elected Zelensky. So what Damien and I will do this evening is talk through a number of case studies of how wars have ended, illustrating these issues of coercion, compromise, military balance, internal, external pressures. So Damien, over to you. Do you want to start off with an example of a negotiator, please?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you to the Institute for making this evening possible. And thank you to Richard in particular for inviting me to be part of this project over lunch about 3 or so years ago. It's been a journey, as they always are, and it's been a very interesting and fruitful one. I've had experience in a number of negotiated conflict resolution situations, but I think the best known one is that of Aceh, which was in 2005. You may or may not remember that Boxing Day 2004, there was a massive tsunami in the Indian Ocean. It impacted Sri Lanka quite heavily. It impacted Aceh very heavily. In Aceh, something like 180,000 people were killed. All of the low-lying infrastructure was completely destroyed, and it was a catastrophe of huge proportions. And a lot of people have, not unreasonably, said, well, this was the catalyst for peace. And it certainly was a driver, but it wasn't necessarily the catalyst as such. What most people don't know is that 2 days before the tsunami, the Free Aceh movement, which had been fighting a guerrilla war with the Indonesian government for the previous 30 years, had agreed to talk. This is 2 days before the tsunami. And they had agreed to sit down and have some sort of negotiated process. The tsunami came, of course, that then provided greater impetus for those talks. But what we found was that even though the Indonesian government, it was a new government then of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who had come to office promising to resolve the war in Aceh, even with that sort of support, it was an enormously complex and difficult process. What we did find, though, was that the intersection of a number of other factors helped bring this to a successful conclusion. There was, of course, the issue of simply alleviating the suffering of the people. The Acehnese are particularly devout Sunni Muslims, and many of them were convinced that this was a message from God, that perhaps they had behaved badly and they were being punished. And I tried to persuade them that perhaps that's not the way God actually worked. And that led to another series of theological discussions. But there was those sorts of influences. So the Free Aceh movement immediately declared a ceasefire to allow work to start to alleviate the suffering of the people. And the Indonesian government also made gestures in that direction as well. But the Indonesian military, which operated then and still largely operates quite independently of the government, said, no, we're going to continue with the war. We're going to continue to prosecute what they thought was going to be a military victory. The international community, though, was by this stage becoming engaged. At that time, it was to become the world's largest aid program ever. About $5 billion was tipped in. There were dozens of countries involved. And they said, these countries that were providing a range of supports to try to resolve the problem post-tsunami, said, we can't work in an environment where there's a war going on. We want you to fix it. And they put pressure on the Indonesian government, and they put pressure on the Free Aceh movement. They said to the Free Aceh movement, we will never recognise your claim for independence, but we will support you if you negotiate for a peaceful resolution, without saying what that looked like. The process we had to exclude in this process. We had to exclude the military. They came in as spoilers. We had them on the Indonesian negotiating team, and every time we thought we were going to get an agreement, I think we had 104 points of agreement in the end. Every time we thought we were getting close to an agreement, the two generals who were on the Indonesian negotiating team would come in and wreck it. They would say, no, we're not going to do this, or we're going to do something else which will spoil it, which will undermine it, increase military pressure, whatever it happened to be. I complained about this to the Indonesian president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. I said, we simply can't operate with spoilers involved in the process. They were removed. And removing spoilers from a process is enormously important in allowing it to then build constructive steps towards some sort of an outcome. Each of the 104 points was a hurdle, and each hurdle was difficult to get over. But not having the spoilers there trying to trip us up before we got to the hurdle was probably one of the biggest steps in favour of getting a resolution. The other was that Indonesia had been undergoing a process of democratisation since 1998. Its own interpretation of democracy. It's a very particular version of democracy, but they were subscribing, particularly under Yudhoyono, they were subscribing to broad, internationally accepted rules of democratic transition, one of which is controlling the military, bringing it under civilian authority. Yudhoyono was an Indonesian general, and in transition theory, generals, reformist-minded generals, are the best place to bring about that sort of a change, because they have the links back into the military structure. They have credibility. They know what levers to move to get particular outcomes, and their reform orientation gels with the civil community. So Yudhoyono was clearly the best person. So we had on our side, to get an outcome, we had a reformist-minded general who was a Democrat. Indeed, his political party was called the Democratic Party. To cut what could be a very long story short, we ended up agreeing around a form of words which allowed for Aceh to have its own political parties and to have an internationally supervised democratic electoral process. That was unheard of for Indonesia. The Indonesian law does not allow for local political parties because the elites in Jakarta believe that will lead to separatism. In this case, I argued for creating these, or having these parties being allowed to be created in order to resolve separatist claims, not to enhance them. That got through the legislature largely intact. There's still some unhappiness in Aceh, but with that in place, with local political parties, the Achenese felt that they had extracted a fair deal on one hand, and that they would be largely in control of their own destiny afterwards without achieving independence, but having a high level of autonomy, what we referred to as the 70% agreement. I think in this, and this is what I've talked about to a lot of independence movements, is when I say to them, what do you want? And they say, we want independence. I say, what does independence mean? What do you want to achieve through that? And I say, oh, we want education, healthcare, jobs, economic distribution, blah, blah, blah. I say, okay, why don't we aim for those things? Take independence off the table and let's look at what it is you actually want to achieve. That's what the Achenese did, and that's the agreement that we ended up getting. I've spoken to a number of other organisations, and that's been, I wouldn't say a light bulb moment, but it's been a different way of approaching it, which has produced a much more flexible negotiating position, and which governments which are opposed to separatist movements are usually much more prepared to engage with. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
You talked about removing the spoilers in the negotiation process, taking those two generals out. If you regard the Indonesian army generally as a spoiler, how during the implementation of the peace agreement, was there any evidence of the Indonesian military attempting at a lower level to sabotage the agreement? And if not, why not?
Well, the agreement specified that one thing the Indonesian government always wanted to avoid, and the Indonesian military wanted to avoid, was the internationalization of the conflict, that is to bring in external actors. And part of the agreement was that this could only be achieved if the international community was represented on the ground. And that was through the Aceh monitoring mission, which comprised most of the countries of the EU and Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei. I think that was it. And that internationalization put independent monitors on the ground, which were then able to report on infractions of the agreement by the Indonesian military. So there were a few problems in the implementation, but on balance, it went more smoothly than anybody could have reasonably have hoped for. And the fact that it's now lasted, 17, coming up 18 years is, I think, a testament to the essential soundness of the agreement that we put in place at that time.
So that's an example really of the negotiated peace. But there are examples of winning and losing. One is in Sierra Leone. During the 11-year Sierra Leone war, there were multiple international attempts to end it. All but the last failed, despite multiple signed peace agreements. In each case, the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, a guerrilla movement, reneged on the agreement and used the ceasefire around the agreement to regroup and rearm. Now, the main reason for these failed agreements at peace, or failed attempts at peace, was because the international community, the UN, the US, and the UK all mischaracterized the war as a civil war. And indeed, even today, even the Sierra Leone war on Wikipedia is described as a civil war. A war between two sections of the community that somehow could be reconciled by a rebalancing of power. But the RUF didn't represent any part of the community whatsoever. They never sought popular legitimacy by winning the hearts and minds of the people. Instead, for them, the civilian population was a resource to be enslaved. Men for labor, women for sex or forced marriage, children to be enrolled as child soldiers. And their goals, such as they existed, were power and enrichment, mainly through exploitation of mineral resources, especially, of course, diamonds, blood diamonds. So for peace to be attained, the RUF had to be defeated militarily rather than negotiatively, which in the end, with a lot of Nigerian help and a bit of British help, the democratically elected government finally achieved in 2002. Now, in Sierra Leone's case, the principal cause of the war was not intra-societal tensions or divisions, but poor governance over the previous 2 decades. Poor governance that permitted space for the growth of a hyper-violent, seemingly nihilistic guerrilla movement, the RUF. And after the war had been won, the absence of violence allowed improvements in governance that were fundamental to a lasting peace. An imperfect peace, but nevertheless a peace that lasts to the current day with democratic change of government. So in this case, military victory was essential to stop the fighting and allow peace. But lasting peace, of course, doesn't always follow military victory. We'll talk shortly about examples of where that has occurred.
Richard, can I ask you, what do you see as the strengths and the weaknesses of the resolution? There was a military outcome. what were the strengths and perhaps some of the weaknesses of that form of resolution?
I think probably the most important aspect was that the war was won by the Sierra Leoneans rather than an outsider. Yes, they had help from, say, mentioned Nigeria, they had help from the UK, from Guinea. But essentially, it was fought and won by the Sierra Leoneans. And what the democratic elected government of Sierra Leone was able to do was to mobilize the population through the raising of militia forces. So at a very local level, villagers felt as though they were protected by government-supported forces that were indeed theirs. So what the government was able to do was to localize support for them in a way that the RUF was never able to do. And when it came to elections after the conflict, when the RUF put up a presidential candidate, it won 3% of the vote, whereas President Kaba won 67% of the vote. So it just shows the extent to which the country supported the government and built the foundations for peace. Following the war, there was, of course, a war crimes tribunal, which was an important part of, and I'm very nervous here because I got one of the prosecutors sitting in the front row. A war crimes tribunal that was an extremely important part of bringing reconciliation that only prosecuted really the people most responsible. But at the community level, reconciliation occurred through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which allowed a very local level of reconciliation to take place. Of course, there were issues, but it probably worked surprisingly well.
Was the arming of local militias a subsequent problem in terms of the handing back of weapons or having a community awash with weapons?
No, the DDR process, the disarmament process, which was overseen by the United Nations force in Sierra Leone, actually was very effective and well supported. Whereas the UN did very little to help bring the war to an end, their independence was extremely important for building peace afterwards. So, an example perhaps where winning and losing didn't really build a lasting peace.
Yeah, look, the example of Sri Lanka, which I have in the book in question, I contrast it with Aceh because on one hand, we had the Indian Ocean tsunami, it being, if not a catalyst, at least being part of an impetus towards a peaceful resolution. On the other hand, Sri Lanka was also heavily affected. But in Sri Lanka, what happened was the Tamil Tigers in the north and the east of the country demanded of the government that they be responsible for the expenditure of aid in the areas they control. And the government said no. And that ultimately led to a breakdown in relations. There had been a long-standing ceasefire. Indeed, the north and east of Sri Lanka was operating as a separate country. Effectively, it had its own border, its own checkpoints, its own immigration, its own tax, police department, you name it. So that broke down that over this issue of the allocation of aid for reconstruction and rehabilitation. Meanwhile, the Sri Lankan army re-equipped. It used, as Richard said, used the period of the ceasefire to rearm. And China in particular was a major supplier of weapons. Also Israel, Singapore, and the government simply had greater capacity to buy weapons internationally than the Tamil Tigers did. They had some capacity, but not nearly as great. And that ultimately led to a breakdown. Now, when I spoke to the Tamil Tigers and talked to them about some ways forward, which might find a resolution, we talked about this idea of autonomy, internal self-government, compromise, and so on. And interestingly enough, the leadership said at that time, yes, we'll do that. We're happy to consider that after we get Trincomalee. Trincomalee is a major port in Sri Lanka. And I said, oh, if you don't have it now, you're not going to get it back. The balance shifted, that's gone. And they said, no, that's going to be our new capital. We must get that back as the heart of our future project. Anyway, they didn't get Trincomalee back. And the story was, as I think we all know, that the military launched a major offensive. I was actually in the Tamil Tiger area when this started. And in the end, I think something like 40,000 people were killed as the Sri Lankan government prosecuted the remainder of the war. They were indiscriminate. They had ended up with what's called a victor's peace. That is, the victor of the war imposes the terms of the subsequent peace. And those terms were ultimately those which continued to exclude and marginalise ethnic Tamils in Sri Lanka. The ethnic Sinhalese, the majority of the population, largely don't regard Tamils as being legitimate citizens of the state, which is a fundamental problem in terms of state cohesion. Because they didn't address the underlying problems which led to the civil war and that degree of ethnic conflict, those problems remain. Now, I don't see the Tamil Tigers coming back anytime soon, but the drivers of that war are still there. It took from the mid-1950s until the mid-1970s for those drivers to finally burst into life as full-blooded conflict. And it may take 20 years or more before that happens again. But the drivers are still there, the problems are still there, they haven't been addressed. And this is one of the problems of winning, but then not taking into account the concerns of the losing party. The losing party feels aggrieved, and that grievance can then spur future conflict. But I think Richard has an experience in Northern Ireland where the result was quite different.
One question there on Sri Lanka. You mentioned the international support for the Sri Lankan, military support for the Sri Lankan army. After the war, was there no international pressure on the Sri Lankan government to conduct some kind of reconciliation, inter-ethnic reconciliation?
There was some commitment to that rhetorically, but it was never really implemented in practice. And I think this is the problem. Also, I mean, this during the last stages of the war, when civilians were being massacred in droves, in a no-fire zone, for example, which the Army and Air Force bombed mercilessly. This was before the United Nations Security Council. And there was genuine alarm at what was going on in Sri Lanka. And there was talk about external intervention by the UN. China, which is one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, vetoed all further discussion of any UN involvement, which meant that the pressure that could have been applied by the international community to have a more mediated or more regulated outcome was lost. And that was because China was at that stage wanting to emphasize its growing power on the world stage. This is keeping in mind, this is back in 2007. We've seen how far it's come since then. But it was starting to flex its muscles, and it was saying, we want Sri Lanka as a future ally. We want Sri Lanka as a base, a naval base in our global strategy at Hambantota. They extracted a price for their support, and that's a price that Sri Lanka is now continuing to pay, not least in the recent economic crisis that Sri Lanka has experienced. That was largely, not entirely, but largely a consequence of the nature of Sri Lanka's debt to China.
I mean, and it's interesting, you mentioned Northern Ireland, of course, was in completely different circumstances, but the outcome is eerily similar.
The 1998 Good Friday Agreement ended nearly 30 years of political violence in the province. And it largely came about because the ethno-sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland had evolved into a mutually hurting stalemate. And for those who put so much of our lives and our blood into bringing peace to Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement was a godsend. But it didn't address the causes of the conflict, which was societal division and discord. In some respects, the Good Friday Agreement has institutionalized division. Political parties are sectarian. Schools are completely segregated by religion. The so-called Belfast peace walls, constructed during the conflict to protect communities from each other, still stand 5 meters high, dividing people and hindering attempts at societal reconciliation. As a result, peace in Northern Ireland remains extremely fragile. Today, of course, threatened by the impact of Brexit. Interestingly, I was speaking to a colleague earlier today who pointed out that all the male architects of the Good Friday Agreement have gone on to new careers as global peace ambassadors or substaff, while the women have disappeared from sight. This mirrors one of the papers given at our conference by Jasmine Westendorf, who pointed out that in the last 30 years, only 4% of all signatories and witnesses to 4 peace agreements around the world, only 4% have been women. This reflects that it's mostly the men, of course, who do the fighting. And therefore, it's mostly the men who think they can end the fighting. But ending the fighting isn't the same as building peace. And to build peace, you need women as well. They need to be fully involved. So perhaps, just perhaps, if more women had been involved in building and implementing the Good Friday Agreement, we wouldn't have such a fragile situation in Northern Ireland today. So,
I've got a question on that. We've seen a shift in the demography of Northern Ireland, the demographics. The Catholics were in a minority at the time of the agreement. They're now in a numerical majority, and they have a majority of seats in the Northern Ireland Parliament. The Northern Ireland Parliament hasn't sat, or the government that it formed hasn't cohered. So can you elaborate on how that's come about and what that means for peace?
well, there's no doubt that the unionist community, generally Protestant, as opposed to the Republican community, generally Catholic, who would prefer to be part of the United Ireland, today feels at threat in the way that the Republican nationalist community felt at threat yesterday. So the situation has definitely changed, but the problem of a society that is split on sectarian lines remains, and the fact that we haven't been able to build a united society is what is at root the problem, not whether they are governed from Dublin or London. To be honest, London and Dublin probably don't mind what the solution is, as long as there is a solution where it can be managed. It is society has not really caught up with the real situation in Northern Ireland.
And what does that mean for the continuation of the Good Friday Agreement?
Watch this space, I think. We have to spend a few minutes, I think, talking about Ukraine.
Sure. Quickly.
So what's, bearing in mind what we'll be talking about in terms of our approximate model, what's your take on Ukraine?
Well, I think there's broad agreement that the war in Ukraine is at broadly a stalemate. Russia has considerable resources and has some support from China, a little bit from India, and a number of other countries. Of course, Ukraine has the support of NATO and the United States in particular. I mentioned earlier, before we started this evening, the United States seems to be quite happy to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. So there's no, unless all the Ukrainians die, this war is going to go on. There was an agreement after the events of 2014 whereby the Donetsk basin area, Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, would have a referendum on autonomy that would reflect their different ethnic and economic makeup, but remain within the Ukrainian state. Now, both Russia and the separatists in those areas and the Ukrainian government all agreed at this time. And there was actually an agreement which neither side subsequently respected. And that, I think, sowed the seeds for the subsequent war, which we currently see. So is that still a viable option? I think now it's not, and I'm all for negotiation, but I suspect it's probably gone too far that from a Ukrainian point of view, they want to have absolute control of their territory as recognised in international law. And Russia, particularly Vladimir Putin, and it's his personal project, has tapped into what's referred to as the Ruski Mir, the Russian worldview, and says Ukraine is properly a part of the greater Russia. And these are obviously irreconcilable. Richard and I have talked about this in the past. If Putin was to disappear, this war would probably end. And that may be how it finishes. Alternatively, the only other alternative I can see is something like the Korean Peninsula, where you have a ceasefire that ultimately cements the division, which is a de facto recognition of the separation without it being recognised in international law.
And I think we're facing the possibility in Europe of a new Iron Curtain. There's no doubt that is a possibility. But it is not a given. It appears to be in most of the Western discourse a fact that what is today Russia will always be in Russia. But you only need a little bit of political imagination to realize that actually Russia does have an alternative future. It doesn't have to always be like it is today, angry, resentful, and dangerous behind a new Iron Curtain. And it's that future that we need to work towards. But it's not a future that will ever exist with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. Okay.
So the question, I guess, is how many Russians might agree with that outcome and start to plot his demise? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Watch this space. Okay. I think we're probably at a stage where you need to sum up.
Okay. Well, okay, how wars end? As one of our contributors to the book put it very succinctly during the conference that we had, one way to end a war is to lose it. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. The Allies lost, essentially. They got involved in a war far away and one way or another managed to mishandle it and lost. So that's one way to end a war. Obviously, as Richard has discussed, winning can also end a war. But as we saw at the end of the Second World War, if you want to win a war and maintain a peace, you have to rebuild. You have to rebuild the peace. Germany, or Western Germany, was rebuilt as a democratic industrial state. The grievances which led to the Second World War were largely addressed. Japan was rebuilt and became an economic superpower. It always had that potential. It had some of that history. So winning doesn't mean, as we see in Sri Lanka, a victor's peace. it can mean recognising that the future, if it's to remain peaceful, needs to be rebuilt. There needs to be rebuilding, that the peace needs to be worked on. It's not a given. And of course, in all of this, most wars end with some sort of negotiation, even if it's just a case of, yes, we accept that you've won, and can we have some terms? Or more broadly, some agreement around what each side might take away, which is not what they really want, but it's the minimum that they're prepared to accept. And these are three largely the ways that these wars do end. But as I say, I think if we don't have a building of the subsequent peace, then war is likely to resume, as indeed happened in Europe following the Great War. Richard, your takeaways?
Can't turn this on.
So,
my takeaway is
we've got a roving microphone to come around, so if you have a question, please stick your hand up. So we'll start in the room and then we'll come to the Zoom audience. So
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm doing a PhD at Monash on spoiler identification and assessment methodologies, specifically looking at the normative assumptions behind these methodologies. So I want to speak to something that you both have mentioned tonight, which is on spoilers, obviously, and women's inclusion in peace agreements. And I want to ask, what are the implications on a gender inclusive model and sustainable peace if the grievances and demands of male combatants are frequently prioritized through spoiler identification? Thank you.
And the problem is mistaking the ending of the fighting with the creation of peace. And that is the issue. And it's so easy, as in Sri Lanka's case, to think that ending of the fighting means that you've achieved peace. It worked in Sierra Leone because actually it wasn't the RUF that was the problem, it was the governance that was the problem. And once the fighting was finished, you could actually fix the governance and make things work. I can't really, because I'm not sufficiently of an expert, really answer your question, I suspect, in the way that you would like me to, simply because I'm, it is not an area that I can give anything more than my anecdotal experience of what I've seen. I don't know if you can give more of a better answer than that.
To take the Aceh case study as an example, one of our negotiators in the Free Aceh movement team was a woman, and the Indonesians, the Indonesian negotiating team, were all men. And the first thing they said when we sat down at the table to negotiate was, the woman has to go. That we don't want women here. And it was a very to say it was patriarchal is an understatement. It was an incredibly exclusive and insulting beginning to the process. We argued that Shadia, the woman in question, was an integral part of the team and that she needed to be included. She had links back into the community, back into the women's groups, and tried to represent them in our discussions. Now, to be fair, I don't think that really ended up contributing a great deal to the negotiated process that we achieved. But Shadia went on from that process to found a number of subsequent women's groups in Aceh, and they were essential to building and sustaining the peace. And I think that that was enormously important. One of the things we also did while we were going through this process is that at the start, we decided we needed to engage with civil society in Aceh to bring them in, to give them buy-in to the process. And this was at a point when I thought we were actually going to fail. But the civil society people were very enthusiastic, particularly the women. And as we kept going through this process, which went over about 6 months, we made the civil society groups larger and larger and larger in their representation, which meant more women were involved in the process. So by the end, by the time we got to an agreement, we actually had buy-in from civil society and from women represented in civil society. And they were ultimately an essential ingredient in the success, such as it's been, of that resolution.
Thank you. Thanks for an amazing discussion. And Richard, thank you for almost answering my question, because I had said, I was just about to ask how the wars actually end, because the Ukraine conflict isn't even described as war. It is an operation, as people may remember. But you actually referred to it as fighting. So that's where I was about to get to. However, because of the discussion we've just had now, I wonder how the ending of war and the absence of women in the fighting and also in the rebuilding the peace or building the peace has got anything to do with the absence of women in the actual decision of going to war. Can you comment on that?
I mean, it is commonplace to say that women leaders go to war less frequently than male leaders. The evidence doesn't actually support that. Actually, there have been a number of wars. You just need to think of Margaret Thatcher, for example, and sending British forces down to the Falkland Islands. So there's been a number of cases where actually women have been led countries through wars, but that's not really the question that you were raising. And of course, in much of the world where many of the wars take place, particularly across Africa, we are talking about patriarchal societies where women are indeed excluded from the kind of decision making that starts conflict. I don't think that I can really answer again, like I can't really answer the previous question properly, because the answer is self-evident. I think that if there was a greater inclusion, then there would be far fewer of the really senseless wars that we've seen. It wouldn't be the end of war, I don't think, but we'll probably see fewer. But on the other hand, the societal changes that would enable that greater inclusion are massive, absolutely massive.
just very quickly, again, it's a commonplace that an absence of war is not peace as such, and that you do need to have civil society working towards building a peace and making peace a project which everybody's engaged in. And if women aren't involved in that project, you've lost half the community. I mean, to start with, that's fundamental. So it's absolutely essential that women, through representative organisations and through respect for women as contributors to society at the ballot box, have a full voice. And as Richard said, a lot of societies which continue to be involved in wars, not all, but a lot, do tend to be patriarchal. They do tend to exclude women, and bringing women into the process of building peace in particular is, I think, essential for that peace to be sustained.
Peter wants to ask a question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Peter Kuzmin. I'm a Russian pro-democracy activist here in Australia. Obviously, getting involved in conflict resolution carries lots of risks for the international organizations or the countries that try to influence the outcome. Do you think the motivation of these external forces to intervene on values is actually diminishing, and now there is interest in just pragmatic of ending of killing of people rather than trying to instill certain values like the value of human, the individual human life, the individual human rights. Obviously, that has an impact on the resolution of the Ukraine war.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's about, if I can put it this way, between specific values and universal values. And we see, particularly with the United States, where it's been involved in conflicts trying to impose what it sees as its ideal world view, its idea of democracy. And I've got to say, the American understanding of democracy is very particular. It's not universal at all. In terms of achieving sustainable outcomes and having external involvement, which requires a value shift, if you like, I think that it's problematic when it starts to interfere with culture, but I would subscribe to the view that there are some universals, human dignity being one of them. I think in any culture anywhere in the world, you will find human dignity is a give. It's seen as bedrock. And when it's infringed upon, there are problems. The question is, how do you build on specific understandings of universal values, such as human dignity, and build that up through a system or explain it through a system so you essentially translate universal ideas into local culture? It's tricky, but it can be done. So you can go to, for example, Muslim communities which have experienced dictatorship and talk about representation. And you can go to the Quran. The shuras, the councils, have a foundation in the Quran. Accountability has a foundation in the Quran. The removal of unjust leaders has a foundation in the Quran. So it's perhaps about understanding the nuances of cultures and engaging with them respectfully and walking with people through a process rather than telling people what the process is and imposing it.
But for 20 years, we lectured Afghanistan on human rights, on women's rights, female education, and partly said, this is why we're fighting in Afghanistan. When the time came to pull out of Afghanistan, all of that was regarded as being irrelevant. it's a very, very difficult thing for everybody who's been involved in Afghanistan to have to deal with. So you're quite right, you know, it's a very good question, and but it's a difficult answer.
Sasha Uzanov, question for Richard. Britain no longer fights wars for Britain. It now fights wars for the US, such as Iraq and Afghanistan. The last British war was it the Falklands? Would you agree with that?
I would agree that most wars now that the West are involved in are as part of alliances or coalition efforts. Actually, it's probably right that it is. I don't necessarily regard it as being fighting America's wars, although in particular Iraq and Afghanistan actually were. So your thesis is right in as much as there are definitely two data points on that particular graph.
McDougall, University of Melbourne. Thank you very much for your wide-ranging observations. I had a question about asking you to reflect on this notion of winning the war but losing the peace. So just mentioning an example, is sometimes said that by keeping the southern states in the United States in the context of the Civil War, this made the US in the long term more conservative, and you can see certain links with Trumpism and so on, or end of the First World War, harsh peace, consequence, Second World War, or even Cold War. You think of that as a war, there were some hot episodes. In the aftermath of that, the United States has taken a fairly tough line. So do you think generally it's better for victors to be magnanimous in peace rather than taking a tough line?
I think I'm speaking for Richard here. I think he would agree that the worst perpetrators of crimes against humanity and so on need to be punished. But that beyond that, yes, you know, you need to be magnanimous in victory, because if you don't have that magnanimity, then the peace is going to be hollow and ultimately won't be able to be sustained. It's pretty simple.
And understanding the causes of war and then what sustains it, and they're not always the same thing, is hugely important in understanding how to build peace. And as I mentioned earlier, the Sierra Leone example, understanding that the real cause of the conflict was poor governance, you know, rather indicated as to this is the way that we're going to have to build peace.
Well, hello, thank you so much for this talk. There has been talks about the UN recognizing Taliban in Afghanistan. I wanted to know your thoughts about that and whether you see it as an implication of perpetuating the patriarchal system, or maybe there's an opportunity there for building peace, as you say, and including women.
I think it would take a great optimist to think that engagement with the Taliban would persuade them to adopt a more inclusive society. And I understand that today or yesterday, most UN agencies have made the decision, the heartbreaking decision, to withdraw from Afghanistan simply because the Taliban government will not allow them to employ women. So as I say, I think it would take a great deal of optimism to think that anything we do right now in the short term is going to influence the Taliban government. In the longer term, I'm not so sure. What do you think?
The United Nations is probably not aptly named, and I'd make a distinction between nations, which are bonded groups of people, and states, which are geopolitical structures. They're separate. The United Nations, it's called nations, but actually recognized states. So in that respect, recognizing the state of Afghanistan doesn't legitimize the regime which runs it. In the same way, recognizing the state of Myanmar doesn't legitimize the Tatmadaw, the military which runs that country at the moment. So it's possible to recognize the Taliban as being the governing authority of a state without necessarily engaging with it or supporting it or providing succor to it in any way. And I think that that gets back to some of the difficulties that agencies have found trying to work in Afghanistan because they have such an exclusionary policy towards women. Large proportions of the staff that they employ simply aren't able to work. And as a consequence, the agencies aren't able to work. So recognizing the UN recognizing the Taliban as the regime in Afghanistan is not the same thing as actual engagement.
Richard, just one to finish off on Zoom, quick one, partly to do with the book, but Peter Londy says, you'd mentioned the lack of female signatories to peace agreements. In the book, only one of the articles is from a female contributor. Does that reflect a lack of female academics interested in this sphere? I think not, but perhaps you could just elaborate.
Obviously not. I mean, it's an area that we need to work on and encourage more people to be involved in. And much of the conversation this evening has demonstrated, I think, the importance of inclusivity. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard and Damien and Dyson House audience and Zoom audience. Thank you for your interest and your questions. Appreciate all the amount of time and Ian, the intern, that went into the virtual conference and subsequently into the book. There were many, many people contributing, not all of whom obviously wrote articles in the book, but it's been really interesting discussion. Appreciate your insights, both of you, and thank you all very much. And book sales are open for those at Dyson House. Thank you.